First of all, I just want to say huge congratulations on winning Architect of the Year at the ARAJ 2019 Women in Architecture Awards. I mean, it's one of many awards that you've won, and international and Irish awards. And I know everybody here is just dying to hear your story. Talk to us. So we're not going to. This is not going to really be about O'Donnell Tuomey's work per se. It's more about Sheila the woman, Sheila the architect, and her career path and observations along the way. So I hope you're happy enough to talk on that light.
Yeah, Carole. Yeah.
So as you know, earlier on I mentioned our absent friend Susan Cogan, and I know that you knew Susan very well. In fact, she worked with you. So if there's just maybe you'd like to share some.
Yeah,
story about that.
I suppose in a way, Susan was very much part of the story of our practice across many years. First of all, she was a student of ours, and then, because she was such a fantastic student, we asked her to come and work for us in the summer, and I don't know if it was a summer job or a year out, but she worked with us in 1989-90, and when we were probably just me, John and Susan, I think, or maybe there was someone else there, I'm not sure. And actually I was pregnant, so I went on maternity leave, so then it might have been just Susan and John left in the office. But, and actually, apart from John and our parents, Susan was the first person to hold our son Daniel, because John was going up from the office to visit me in the rotunda, and she said, can I come and see the baby? So, and Daniel subsequently babysat for Will and Susan's kids. So there is a lot of woven connection between us, and it's kind of work and it's family. And then, having been our student and worked for us, Susan was subsequently our client. So, because when we came to be appointed to do the Sean O'Casey Centre down in the Dublin Docklands, Susan was working there, and she was the architect client for that project. And while John McLaughlin was the senior architect, Susan was the person who directly dealt with us on the project. So it was really interesting to find someone that we knew so well and who we respected so much and had worked with us now being a client. So in a way, she has been in our lives in many capacities. And maybe that's very typical of Susan, because I think that across her life she did, as you mentioned earlier, so many different things. And it was, I think she had a fantastic capacity to combine her commitment to her personal life and to her work life. And so she kept adjusting her work life in response to what was happening with the birth of her children and her home life, and making that amazing house in Francis Street with Will, which really was a life project. So yes, my sympathies to Will, and I remember her with great respect and affection.
Yeah, indeed.
And sorry, the morning that we heard the news, John remembered that during that summer when we were entering a project we were doing for the RIAI Awards, Susan made this really beautiful pencil upview axonometric of a project in Parliament Street, which of course didn't get built, and which made it onto the cover of the RIAI Awards book of 1990. So it was just really nice to find a piece of her work in the archives of the office that we could take out and put up on the wall in the office, and now we come in every morning and look at Susan's drawing.
Yeah, so lovely. Thank you for that. Okay, so will we start at the beginning, Sheila? Maybe you could tell us about why you chose to study architecture, and that kind of educational journey that you had.
I mean, when I was in school, I really loved art and I liked English, and I liked maths, but maybe not quite as much as art and English. And I was trying to think about what sort of career would combine the things I enjoyed about those subjects. And I kind of knew that I didn't want to be a fine artist. I didn't think that was the path that I could follow. Maybe the idea, I didn't know that much about architecture, so it was a kind of hunch, but I had this idea that architecture was more like a responsive art, that you're answering a question, and I think in a way that appealed to me. My father was an engineer and put a lot of pressure on me to do engineering, so maybe it was partly compensation to him. No, I'm not doing engineering, but I'll do architecture. And so in a way, I went into architecture not really knowing exactly what an architect did. I probably had never met an architect before I studied. Yeah. But the amazing thing was, within days of starting in first year in UCD in Earlsfort Terrace, I really felt that I had found my world, and that I remember going home on the bus one day and thinking, I'm never going to see the world in the eyes I saw it in before. Within a week I felt I just saw everything differently, and there was no turning back. So we had, there was an amazing first year. I met John in first year, but we weren't a couple until we left fifth year, which just, on the way out the door, we got together. But we had a fantastic first year. We had Shane de Black and Colin O'Neill, Pat Hickey, the artist. And the combination of those people and Cornelia Hope and a couple of other people I'm probably not mentioning, it was a fantastic combination. But maybe in particular, Shane had just come back from working and studying with Louis Kahn. And we didn't realise this at the time, but he brought the spirit of Louis Kahn into the studio. He was Louis Kahn. He asked us to talk to bricks and ask them what they wanted to be. But because we knew nothing about architecture, we thought that was coming from him, which it was, but it was coming from him channeled from Louis Kahn. And I think for some of us, probably for about one group of the year, we just were completely besotted by this thing. And he was living it, and through him, we came to live it. Then, interestingly, when we were in second year, Louis Kahn, probably, I think it was the year he got the Royal Gold Medal, he did a lecture in Dublin in the Carroll's building along the canal. And we managed all to get in and kind of squirm up to the front and sit on the floor. And then when he started talking to bricks and asking them what they wanted to be, we were going, God, he really learned a lot from Shane, didn't he? And then we thought, oh, no, I think it must be the other way around. So we realised then that, and actually it was amazing because when we later went to London, people weren't really talking about Louis Kahn back then in the early, mid-70s. People in Europe weren't very interested in his work. And subsequently did become very interested. So we had this kind of inside knowledge, this very particular spiritual way of thinking about the craft and the making of architecture. So we had a really great first year. And unfortunately, things kind of went downhill then after first year. The very first meeting in second year, the second year tutors said to us, we are going to do everything we can to make you unlearn any of that stuff you got in first year. All that rubbish about bricks and stuff, we don't do that. So it was odd because it just immediately a shutter came down and we thought, we're not on their side, we're on the other side. And actually we had a kind of strange subsequent 4 years where we were kind of holding on to something that we had discovered and which we believed in, which was not what most of the people who were teaching us believed in. So actually what happened is a group of us became each other's tutors, and the library was our education. We went to the library, for 6 months we were Russian constructivists, and then we moved on to being new brutalists, and all the time there was Corbusier, because every summer you might go to Paris because it was easy to get there and see his buildings. So it was a kind of interesting thing about living through looking at work and believing in it. And of course, even then that was quite old work, and maybe we didn't realise how old it was. Although we did get right up to Stirling, and actually just as we were leaving, in our final year, I think was when Rossi published his book about the city, and so we were just beginning to kind of get up to speed with all of that when we finished in UCD. So it was a kind of interesting career where it started very positively, and then maybe it was useful that what happened was we kind of had to decide that if you believe in something, you've got to hold on to it, and even if there's people telling you that that's wrong. I remember in third year, we were doing a project for something down on the Quays, and the little coterie who had been to see Corbin in the summer, or maybe it was fourth year, we all did these Corbusian sort of rendered buildings on the Quays with ramps, trying to go, can you get a ramp to work in a building from bachelor's walk in? And the people teaching us actually thought that we were making a joke about something, and I remember just realising then, God, there are people who are so cynical that they can't see sincerity in a young person. And so all of that, I think, in a way strengthened us, but maybe it also made us feel, you've got to keep going on your own path, and that's how it is. So anyway, after 5 years in UCD, John and I, as I said, left together and went off around Europe looking at Palladio's buildings, actually, and that was a real revelation. We realised that old stuff could also be relevant. We suddenly thought, hey, Palladio, he was doing the same thing we're doing. It's, you could talk about Palladio and Le Corbusier in the same conversation and understand the connections. And then we ended up that autumn in London, and we had an amazing 5 years in London. And that was, I suppose, it's like a second education, 5 years in School of Architecture and 5 years in London. And it was a great time in London. The place was really buzzing. It was 76 when I arrived. There was a huge amount of discussion, and there were always symposia and lectures, and the AA seemed to have something on every night of the week. And Peter Cook had this thing called ArtNet. People went into some room off Bedford Square and sat on deck chairs and shouted at each other about architecture, and Rem Koolhaas screaming at someone else. And it was an amazing time of so much discussion, so many amazing projects being made. Rem Koolhaas and Nelia Zengelis were doing all those projects that later became part of Delirious New York. The swimming pool that floated across the Atlantic, powered by a lot of Russian swimmers swimming in the opposite direction, but driving them from Russia to America. I mean, it's just, they were so polemical, but also the drawings and the paintings were so beautiful, and it just felt like this was the centre of the world for architecture, and we were in it, and we were in our jobs. I was working for a very nice practice in Covent Garden, Spence and Webster, very small. John was working for Sterling, and there was a kind of gang of people that went to all these events, and it really felt like nobody was building, there was no work, but architecture was being made through the discussion and through the projects. And it's interesting that that's how Koolhaas started, and nobody ever thought he ever would build. I mean, then people thought, oh, he's one of those guys who's going to make paper projects and write books. And then along OMA suddenly develops into the huge practice that it is. So it was a really, it really felt very exciting to be there, I think, and to feel, it was a time, the whole Rossi move about rationalism, typologies, but also the renewed interest in the European city, and the interest in referring to historical things was at a kind of early and exciting stage. Then, you had Michael Graves coming over and presenting his first really postmodern projects with incredible drawings, and leading to, again, huge arguments between people about, can you do that? How can you just stick motifs onto things? And you felt, and Leo Carrere was in the middle of his early works too. So it felt like there was so much going on. And after 2 years working for Spence and Webster, I got offered a place in the RCA to do a master's, which was, the title was environmental design, but it really was a kind of master's in architecture. And I wonder if one of the reasons for wanting to do it was partly to kind of compensate for feeling that while we had, in a way, a great time in UCD, there had been some kind of lack of discussion and direction from tutors. And actually a lot of the people who were teaching in the Royal College at that time were the people who had been what was known as the Flying Circus in UCD. And we had come in after the Flying Circus, and we were always there looking at the third years, had all these amazing guys in black velvet suits with long hair coming in and walking, and we were thinking, oh, and we never had them, and they were kind of disappearing in front of us. So John Miller, who was a peripheral part of that, was the head of school in the RCA when I went there, but Ed Jones and Chris Cross and other people who had been part of that Flying Circus were also teaching there. But Ken Frampton did the history course and also taught in the studio. So it was a fantastic, it was a great opportunity to go back and think again about projects as a student. And I suppose, having worked for 2 years, I really appreciated the freedom of being a student again. Having time to just think about projects and work.
So the course wasn't a fine art course by any manner of means.
No, it wasn't.
We'll talk a bit later about your painting and your artwork, but that wasn't where it began.
No, it was very much an architectural course. It was design, and we did quite a lot of work in landscape and urban design as well. But so that's environmental design included landscape, urban design, and architecture. And it was taught by architects mostly. But there were overlap courses. Like we did cultural studies with students who were doing fine art and other things. And because architecture was at the top of the building, we walked past all the other art, painting and sculpture and automotive design and all the other departments in the RCA. So in a way, they had a different ethos than something that's just a school of architecture. There was a sort of sense of being in that architecture is one of the arts that had a relationship with each other.
And then you were talking about, socialising with these, and people sitting in deck chairs and discussing architecture, and Oh, did the wider student body in Royal College of Art, did they become your kind of colleagues as well, or was it really very much the architects?
Only to an extent, yes. There was moments when we had overlaps and people would we'd suddenly do a project with somebody in graphic design about something, or someone would be making a political protest, and we'd all get together. But I would say, because of the way it was in a tower, and every department had a floor. At architect, we had the 2 top floors. So actually, probably that does tend. I mean, people use the term silo now, but you do tend to get a bit siloed if you're in a tower.
Yeah. So
you get the lift up to the 10th floor where the architecture studios were, and there wasn't that much overlap. But I think you were looking over your shoulder, and like at the end of the year, there was the degree show. We had to present your work, and we never had anything like that in UCD. And for the art students, the degree show is a big thing where they're projecting themselves out for their individual career as artists. Yeah. So we had to kind of up the ante and make a show that would also, have some kind of presence. Yeah. The people would come to the RCA degree show, and they go into all the different departments. Yeah. But I think that, we definitely hung out with the other architects, but other art forms, like I would say, in that time in London, cinema was really important, and there was a lot of really interesting European films coming out, and with the community that we hung out with was a very international community. People working in the offices we were working in or studying in the Royal College were from all over the world. And some of them older than us knew a lot more about things like cinema and guided us. And I think it was probably a time when 3 nights a week you'd be going out to some strange foreign film that somebody hadn't heard of before. And of course that's what happens in your 20s, that you have a kind of life where you can, without thinking, just or go to an all-night cinema thing somewhere in East London and not worry about how you're going to get home for work the next morning. But I think for me there were very many layers in London. While I was in the Royal College, I worked in the summers and part-time with John Miller in his office, who was the head of school, but he was in practice with Alan Cahoon, who's a very well-known and respected critic and writer. And I spent a summer drawing the plans in ink on tracing paper at 1 to 50 of 10 great houses of the 20th century for an exhibition that they were preparing. So it was an absolutely amazing summer, because I had to sort of help to do the research to finalise what the definitive plan of the Villa Garsh was. And then I drew it. I mean, the Villa Garsh is huge when you draw it at 1 to 50 on tracing paper. And then the Schroeder house is tiny at 1 to 50. And that was also really interesting, drawing these things. And I just had such great discussions with Alan Cahoon about architectural theory and history, and the relationship between Alto and Corb, or who was better, or what about Ellie and Saarinen. And it was just that was a real privilege to have that summer, just making those drawings and listening to them. There was only 4 of us in the office, I think, just listening to them talking about architecture and their experiences. Yeah.
So was it hard to leave London?
Very hard to leave London, I think, yeah. On the other hand, I think when I went to London, I always believed I would leave. I didn't go there thinking I was moving there for good. I went there thinking it would be great to have these experiences and, see a different way of doing architecture. And I would say that one huge value I took out of that was seeing people like Cahoon and Miller, like Sterling when I worked there later, that there was only 4 people in Cahoon and Miller, and they had hardly any work, and yet they were really well known, famous all over the world, and Japanese people were always coming to the door trying to talk to them or get jobs with them. And they were somehow managing to live a life in architecture by doing things like exhibitions and writing and
competitions
and teaching and competitions, and that they had chosen to live the life that they wanted to live, to do the kind of work they wanted to do. And I think when I left Dublin, really the only kind of architects that were working here were kind of business architects. There wasn't nobody working like that. So finding it was a whole community of people, and not just in the 20s and 30s. I mean, those Cahoon and Miller and Sterling were probably around 50 or in their 40s to 50s, who were living their life according to their decision, and they probably weren't very well off, and they're probably struggling a lot of the time, but that was the way they'd chosen to live, and it meant a lot to them, and they believed in it. So I think that was one of the things that when I came back here we brought with us. But I think that towards the end of that time, the postmodern thing was really beginning to take over, and I felt a lot of architects whose work I had respected and admired before were beginning to do really slightly thoughtless work where they were kind of tacking bits of historic motifs onto projects, and just felt the thing was becoming a bit, I don't know what the word is, it's almost like it's becoming a bit dilettantish or something, and just thought, no, I don't really want to get out of here. I want to get back to something more real. And maybe it's a thing Irish people always have, that you know, people do tend to go away, and then, you know, in pubs in London, people would say, "Will you ever go back? Or are you going back, or what?" And you know, everybody always said, "Yeah, I am going to go back." I mean, it was somehow you went away to come back, and you wanted to be part of whatever was going to be happening in Ireland. So I think that was important. But then there was also that feeling of coming back to a kind of impoverished but sort of less contaminated. That sounds ridiculous. But and of course there was nothing, I mean, all that was going on here was...
But somewhere that you could really make your mark.
Yeah.
Maybe, did you recognise that at that stage?
I think it's hard to know. I remember at one of the very many goodbye to London parties that happened over a year, when, I mean, it wasn't just us, and his friends in Germany and Switzerland and, you know, South America were all going back home as well. But a German friend of ours said to us, very late after a bottle of patty or something, go back and change the face of Irish architecture. Mm. And, you know, we thought, that's a good joke, Walter. But in a funny way, we thought, well, yeah. But the interesting thing was we came back at the same time as a number of other people came back from other places. I mean, Siobhan is here. I mean, Siobhan and Michael had just come back from Germany. Will Grafton, Yvonne and Shelley and Shay and those were here already. They had come back from London before we went, I think, and they were teaching. And there were other people who were kind of collecting. I think Neil and Valerie came back from Italy, and there was a lot of us. You know, we were all quite, annoying. Like we were going on about stuff, and we wanted to change things. And
when was that?
That was in I came back in the end of 1981.
81.
So I think that was a time that, you know, there was absolutely no work, of course. We just nothing to do. But Dublin was interesting. We always said, well, it was full of, like, along the quays, it was kind of beautiful, but almost half derelict, but almost nothing new had been built for, 50 years. And nobody had ever put a new motorway through Dublin like they had through all the provincial British cities. Mm-hmm. So we had this idea that Dublin the bad things hadn't happened yet. It was just nothing had happened, and Georgian houses were crumbling, but things were waiting to happen. So we all started doing these, speculative projects and working with the people who were setting up in Dublin Magazine and Hibernia and doing little projects, how you could turn a house on the quays into an apartment for 3 people. And the very idea that people would live in apartments was really shocking. Who'd live in an apartment on the quays? It's ridiculous. So we just started doing little projects, and I mean, for me, the good thing was Shane de Blackham invited me to join his team in 4th year in UCD, and so I came back in October 1981, just in time to start the academic year. Okay. And really, I suppose I lived on teaching for a number of years, and I was teaching 20 hours a week in UCD for a couple of years, and that was amazing because it gave me, well, first of all, an outlet to talk about all the stuff that had thought about and picked up in those years in London, and then it gave you time to stop and think about what it is you want to do. So somehow we were, and I suppose those probably rents weren't very expensive, and we were all surviving on bits and pieces, and then you could do things like the project for in Dublin, or eventually after a few years we thought we better take on something bigger. So a group of us, calling ourselves City Architecture Studio, decided we would do a master plan for the quays from O'Connell's Bridge down to the docks, and which was a huge part of the city. And we had the sort of banner that we would say 10,000 people could live in that part of Dublin. But that really demolished, just by using demolished and ruined sites, and so we did this project, which was a big endeavour, and that was again, I don't know Siobhan, but Michael certainly, Siobhan and Michael, I think, Neil and Valerie, myself and John, Derek Tynan. Who else was City Architecture Studio? I can't remember. That was all.
So it was the same kind of core group that
it was
became
the people
Group 91.
Who later, some other people who weren't in City Architecture Studio became Group 91. It was, we did this huge project, and then we thought, what are we going to do with it now? We need to exhibit it somewhere, and we decided we needed a gallery then. So the Blackman Mar lent us a room in Dawson Street, and we opened what we called the Blue Studio Architecture Gallery to exhibit that project. And a lot of students came in and helped us to draw it up, and we made a big exhibition. And then Jerry Cahill, who was teaching us at UCD, wrote about it for the AJ, and it was fully published there. So it kind of took on a bit of momentum, especially outside Ireland, because everybody here thought, what are you talking about? I mean, people living in the middle of the city down in the Quays, that's ridiculous. Nobody's ever going to do that. And it was probably only about 5 years later developers started buying up land, and none of us ever designed any of the buildings that eventually got built along the Quays. And having set up the gallery, then we kind of said, we have a gallery now, so what do we do with it? So we put together an exhibition of Aldo Rossi's work and brought over models and drawings, and we made a catalogue, and Shane O'Toole and John O'Regan, who was just setting up Gandon Editions, maybe he was still a student in UCD, published this catalogue of Rossi's, to go with the Rossi exhibition, a book that later became known as the Little Blue Book. And years later, when John and I went to teach in Princeton, I remember with Michael Graves, he said, oh, you were involved in the Little Blue Book. He said, I have that, and I'm always arguing with Peter Eisenman because he has the one with the shiny cover, but I think the one I have with the not shiny cover is the real one. And we said, yeah, you're right, because the not shiny one was published by John O'Regan, and then in London, the AA Academy Editions published it again with a shiny cover. And actually, I just, because I was thinking about this, I looked it up, and you can buy it on Amazon for £450.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, we started, we had through Michael and Siobhan's experience in Germany, put on an exhibition, I think, of Klaus as well, and we made a catalogue of that. So in a way, in those years when none of us had any work, we kind of kept ourselves busy doing stuff, and we thought that was okay. We'll just redesign the whole city, or we'll put on exhibitions. And I think it was an important time of kind of consolidating, getting to grips with what we thought needed to happen here. And I mean, teaching was amazing because many of us were probably surviving through teaching or small work. I was doing small work. I particularly did a house for some friends in Sligo. And then in the mid-80s, another friend in the Irish Film Institute asked me to start looking at feasibilities for different sites, which eventually turned into the Film Centre.
Yeah, I think the Film Centre is... I said it to you before when we were talking about this conversation, and to me, the Film Centre was not long after I finished college myself, and also I was working in Douglas Wallace on Dame Street at the time, so kind of very aware of everything that was going on around the Temple Bar area. But I just so it's one project I wanted to mention this evening, and I picked up this quotation that yourself and John and one or other of you said at the time. And I think it's very pertinent because this is before any conservation legislation was in place. We didn't have protected structures. I know we had listing, but it was very arbitrary and really didn't mean anything. And you said at that time, working slowly on this project through the processes of research, survey, design, demolition, repair, reuse, building and rebuilding set us on a course by which we still steer today. I think that's very interesting. And then would you still kind of see yourself aligned to that statement?
Yeah, I would very much see that. It was for us an absolutely amazing project to have. I mean, it was when I first started doing the feasibility studies. John was working in the Office of Public Works, but then when they finally found the site in Temple Bar in Eustace Street, and which of course was before Temple Bar was Temple Bar. I mean, the amazing thing was the Film Centre was going to be built on that site, and the bus station was still going to happen all around it. So all the rest of Temple Bar was going to be demolished, and the Film Centre would have been just sitting there in the middle of that. Anyway, we started. So it was when it became a real project, which took about 2 years, that John finally left the Office of Public Works. But yes, I think it was a slow process, which was probably very helpful. And we for example, we surveyed the building ourselves, and I think and it's a really complex. We worked there was 9 separate buildings built at different times, and they're all different geometries and different shapes. And measuring them and just spending the time in the buildings, making the measurements to make the drawings, was a really important part of a kind of immersion in understanding the character of those buildings and what they had been and what they might be. And because it did take so long, we had a lot of time to consider all the moves we were making. And I think that what I felt out of doing that project was that I realised that working with old buildings is really interesting because there's something there, there's something physically there to start with. So in your work, you're thinking about detail as well as concept from the very beginning. And somehow the material and the detail is always on the table because you're up against old buildings. And I think that one of the things that came out of it was a realisation that if you're working in an urban or even a rural context, that probably no context is completely new. I mean, even if you're building on an empty site, there are traces of what was there before. There's the neighbouring buildings, or there's previous use, or there's cultural things. It's almost just a question of extent. And the fact that the film centre had these amazing existing buildings that we had to work between and around, was a really interesting education. And in a sense, it also helped to free up. I mean, we probably came back from London and having visited all Rossi's buildings and Corb's, quite a strong kind of rationalist sense of everything being very orderly. And then you find yourself working on a set of old buildings where the geometries are beyond, out of your control, and nothing is a right angle and everything is shifted, and they're all, and you need then to make an intervention that is also somehow a different geometry that pulls it together. I think it freed us up in a way to be more relaxed about somehow about thinking about space and about buildings experientially as much as abstractly as drawings on a page. And I suppose because we were so interested in cinema and really enjoyed going to the cinema, it was just like a dream project to be making a building for cinema. Yeah. And even the fact of it being in that incredible site, which nobody, like until it was put up for sale, nobody knew that place was there. And it was like walking down a corridor and then this whole world unfolding in front of you, which was like a sort of secret place, which seemed very appropriate to the idea of cinema, that you just go through a door on a street and suddenly find yourself in a place that's different. And I think in our project we tried to keep that sense of discovery and wonder in the place, that there would be, and that there would always be a conversation between the old and the new, and the old would continue to
I'm tempted to say that the discovery and wonder in the place is one of the reasons why it's still a very successful cinema. I mean, it's as popular now as it ever was in terms of people going to, and it is just a lovely space to be in.
Yeah, and it's been knocked about quite a bit, and it's, I mean, that's kind of interesting too, things, like in the beginning you're very precious about your work when you do it, and I remember being upset when, the directorship of the film centre changed a few times very early on, and then we thought, God, what are they doing? They put some weird black stuff all over the floor, and something to do with cleaning, and then you realise after a while, you know what, that doesn't matter. Because things, I mean, I think architecture buildings have to be strong enough to allow people to kind of kick them around a bit and do what they want with them to some extent. Yeah. And you have to somehow still be able to see what the main idea or the central aspects of the project are through changes and through time. Because, of course, that was a set of old buildings that we added to, so it's normal that it would continue to evolve and age. And
I think there's a certain element of success to a building that people do want to stay in it and knock it around a bit on the one. And I know as architects we don't like that. We want our concept, our design to stay as it is, static, but nothing is static. So
no, definitely not.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to some conversation about women and women architects. As I said to you, I mean, at an event like this, Women in Architecture, the elephant in the room is the fact that we need to have women in architecture events. And I'm just wondering, now that you are Architect of the Year for Women in Architecture, I mean, do you have, any kind of thoughts about women architects? Oh God, how do you even start with that? I mean, do you have particular thoughts about women in architecture, where we are now in 2019, maybe relative to where you were as a student in UCD all those years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I do have kind of mixed feelings about things like the Women in Architecture Awards, and because I suppose, you would hope that ideally you didn't have to have different special awards for women, that there should just be architecture awards, but, and actually I kind of didn't really decide to enter, but they people in the AR and the AJ more or less put a lot of pressure on and said, okay, we've shortlisted you, you're on it. I said, oh, okay. But actually, I found the whole event in London around this year's Women in Architecture very interesting. And I think what's good about that, and maybe it's been going on for a few years now, and it's kind of evolved. And what I liked about it this year is that it felt a bit like a kind of festival, a celebration. So it wasn't just about the awards. It was actually went on for 2 or 3 days, which in the beginning I was a bit annoyed by because they said you got to come over for 3 days. So, oh, okay. But what was very nice was there was an emerging woman architect award and an obviously emerged woman architect, that was me. But the shortlisted people in both categories, there was a forum in the RIBA in the evening before the awards where each woman presented her work. And that was great. For me, that was the highlight of the whole 3 days because it's just so interesting, especially the emerging, because some of the people I hadn't heard of, women talking about work in Lebanon and young Chinese architect and people from Spain, and just to hear them talking in such an interesting way about their work, and of course the emerged as well, and have the discussion, and the RIBA was full and it was a fantastic atmosphere. And so I thought, okay, well, this is good. This is like a celebration, and it's just focusing on women who've made these works. And I suppose the other thing about it is that it's part of this campaign that the AR and the AJ have. And as part of that campaign, they're doing all these surveys and research into the conditions and finding that, amazingly, a large number of women architects are paid less than men doing the same job, and that women aren't rising through the profession. And as you said earlier, maybe Catherine said, women tend to drop out. So I think that having the event and focusing on it is probably very good, and maybe it allows people to say, well, why is this happening? How could it be? I mean, I find it, as someone working in a smaller practice, it's inconceivable to me how it could happen that women are paid less for the same work as men. But it obviously is happening because that's what the statistics say. But and so having that said and repeatedly said is probably really important. And there is probably a power, I think, in just repetition. If people just, until it stops, that people just keep saying it. And that, certainly, I mean, the statistics are quite detailed for Britain, and that there is quite a significant pay gap between men and women, and also that women are not rising to the position of directors in practices. And I know that you wrote an article last year pointing out that in Ireland the same thing was happening, and I understand that you got a bit of a response from some male directors of practices, and it may even have had an effect on people looking at it, and with a sense of embarrassment slightly changing that. So maybe, I mean, that would to me be evidence that talking about it does work, that you need to say it. And I don't, maybe it needs men, it needs men to change, and of course women who are in senior positions to change, but it needs men to realise that a woman who may well indeed do the terrible thing of going off and having a family can be a responsible, committed senior member of a practice. And in our practice we have plenty of mothers working for us, and I would say, there's one in the front row there, that I would never doubt their commitment to the work they're doing, no more than I would doubt their commitment to their families, both of which I think are present in their work and in their lives. So, in fact, I would say women with families are so used to balancing everything that they're probably better at being committed to being directors in practices than many men.
Good time management and dealing with difficult clients, perhaps. Maybe that might just bring us back to women teaching architecture. You obviously have taken a huge amount from teaching and given a huge amount as a teacher as well. Yeah. And I know you have some interesting thoughts about that, about schools of architecture and the staff.
When we were students, I think there were very few women teaching in school. In fact, in first year, I think there was one woman, and she was an interior designer, which was, kind of the way it was. She was there for that purpose. But then when I came back and was teaching here in UCD, there were lots of women teaching, and I would say it was my impression is at least 50-50. And I think that was so important. And it's not just important that the women are role models for the women students. I think they're another kind of role model for the male students, because a lot of, coming out of Irish secondary, usually single-sex schools, I taught in first year for a number of years. I think boys coming into first architecture were quite shocked to find that there was women teaching them, and taken aback. And so, I wonder, what's she here for? You're thinking, well, actually, she's running the year. Oh, and I think that is really important. That young men coming in to learn architecture are being taught by women who are also working in practice, in positions of importance in practice. So I think teaching is really, really important. I mean, there's an odd thing, this is kind of an aside, but we had an event in UCD a year or two ago about women in architecture, set up by a group of students led by Chloe Lowe. And in the discussion afterwards, I noted that when we set up the Group 91, which was 8 practices and 15 partners or something, it was pretty well 50-50 men and women. And I realised that in the last 10 years, the practices the younger practices who are now prominent in Irish architecture have a much, much lower percentage of women. And I kind of a bit taken aback when I stopped to think about that. Now maybe it's changing again now, looking at the people who are, say, in Venice in the Close Encounters exhibition. But certainly a few years ago, my feeling was that had dropped. And we had a discussion about it and none of us could come up with the answer. The odd thing is that, our generation were not taught by women, and those generations were taught by women. So I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. We need to keep thinking about and keep talking about.
I think we lost more women architects during the recession than men architects. I know we lost a lot of architects and it was a very difficult time, but I do think that more women left not to come back or got into other careers. And one thing that we all talk about all the time is the fact that in schools it's pretty much 50-50. And in the RIAI, I just checked the statistics today actually, and I'm very happy to see that in the registered member class it's gone over 30% for the first time ever. But in the fellows, which is us older people, it drops to 16%. So that distorts the because we're all registered, we're all classified as registered architects, so that distorts the statistic back down to 26 or 27% female, which is pretty much across Europe. But I think as I've said before on many occasions, the fact that 9% of the retired membership is women and 59% of the graduate membership is women tells a really, really strong story. But it's about keeping as many of the 59% in the profession as possible is really important. But I don't know how we do that. None of us know how we do that. But perhaps events like this do help.
I think so. I mean, I think there needs to be a solidarity and support among women, but also between men and women. I was thinking about that event in the RIBA where these emerging women presented their work, and I think that is quite an interesting forum, and maybe as these kind of events, it might be interesting to get not just young women, but maybe women at different stages in practice to present their work from the viewpoints of what it's like to be at different stages. But I mean, obviously, people having children is a big part of it. I would say that we're depending on the men as well to get involved in that case. I mean, in my case, when I was in my 20s, in that time in London, I would say that I thought that I never would have children because I just didn't see how that was possible. I didn't see how it would be possible to have children and still have a full kind of committed life as an architect. So I kind of thought, well, that's probably not going to happen. I mean, the subject of feminism was very big when we were students. I suppose it was a time when we were all reading Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and The Second Sex was a really important book. And I would say in relation to when I did have children, and in our case, because I had that fear of losing something, probably the pressure came from John. Really, he's like, come on, we're going to have kids. I said, well, I don't know. I mean, anyway, because we had, in our previous life as students, we had talked a lot about feminism and the role of the necessity for equality between men and women, and looking at the lives of people like Sartre and de Beauvoir, which, when looked at too closely, are not exactly ideal, because they did live quite strange lives, but they lived amazing lives because they were so committed that they lived in, they never had a home, they lived in hotels, they thought about their work, and we felt we were going to be like that, except with slightly better, relationships between men and women. So I think that's probably important when you're young, that you have some kind of aspirations towards an idealised idea of how life will be. And because John had been one of the people that I most talked to about this in our student days, when it came to us thinking of having children, that in a way, I think the bargain had already been made that if we did, it was not going to be my job. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the actual bearing of the children was my job. But I would say that I'm really lucky because, first of all, because we're working together, and so we're life and work partners. So because we're working together in practice, we had the flexibility between us to decide how to arrange our childcare. And because we'd already agreed in advance that we were going to be absolutely equal and there wasn't going to be any, that's your job, minding the kids, it's my job doing the work, I'd have to say that apart from the actual bearing of the children and the breastfeeding, every other aspect was completely shared equally between us. Mm-hmm. And that is, I know that's actually not that common. Even now, I don't think it's that common.
I think you're right.
And that's, I'm really lucky.
Well done, John.
Yeah, well done, John. No, but I mean, but I think that's right. And that was one thing I was going to say. I think it needs men to make that commitment. And I think I'm looking at Will, who's another one of those fellas who totally did everything that you could do other than giving the birth. It's a huge game for men. I mean, men just have to start realising that if they get, the more involved they get with their kids, the much more fulfilling and rich is their lives. I mean, it's it's a huge plus as a human being. I mean, actually, the other thing is you learn so much from hanging around with kids, about how to be a person. You realise all kinds of things you never knew until.
And they put you back in your place every time you needed to.
All the time. Yeah.
I'm talking about myself now, not you, Sheila. Okay, I'm going to wrap up because I've just had a quick look and I know people have questions that they want to ask. So if anyone would like to ask Sheila anything that I haven't covered so far, you're more than welcome.
It's really just, first of all, congratulations. It's been wonderful hearing all this. What I share with you, your, iffiness, if you like, about the woman architect thing. In literature, I get really annoyed when people talk about women writers. Yeah. I think there's only two categories, good and bad. Everything else is irrelevant. And it's hard that we have to fight for the ordinary. Yeah. But I just think it's something, just hearing you discuss it, that this kind of forum does help to get awareness, but also really making men aware and men becoming aware and doing as John did. And in fact, my husband did as well. I was very lucky in that regard. It just needs more of us to do that and to be role models as you are. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for this.
The people that you've worked with, and something else that I've sort of come across is there's an expectation that it isn't just from both sides, the client side and the design team side, that it isn't just male voices speaking to each other. The people have an expectation that the people who are going to be using your building aren't just men, and aren't just men of a certain age. Therefore, you need to bring a wider body of experience or a wider kind of voice. Has that changed through the course of your career?
I don't know. I think it's just different in every project. I'm not sure if it has changed. I mean, I suppose it has gradually. There was a great moment, I think it was when we were building the Cherry Orchard School, when Gina, I think, was the project architect on that, and I was the working with the partner in charge, and the engineer, I think, was a woman, and then the so-called foreman, now called what site manager, was a woman. And there was a feeling of, the whole building was being built by women. Actually, in that case, the clients we were dealing with were mostly men, and that's because they hadn't yet appointed a principal, and that's a whole other story of bad stuff. But I think that's true, that it goes way beyond just the architects, and that's why that was amazing to have that. Even that we'll still call her the foreman, Susan the foreman, was a woman, which was fantastic. I think clients are very often women, and I suppose it has. I think that in most fields, probably the discussion about whether it's a man or a woman doesn't come up. You're not surprised if it's either or, whichever it is. It just somehow still remains in architecture a little bit of a subject. And there obviously have been the cases recently, like the most publicised one about Denise Scott Brown not being included in the Pritzker Prize when I've forgotten that man's name, Venturi got the Pritzker Prize. But I thought it was kind of funny, the women in architecture. Like, I was presenting a project which I had done with John for Budapest. A woman from OMA presenting a project she had done. Almost all the projects that were shortlisted of the women in architecture were done by women working with men. And I wondered what I would think if the special prize given to just John. And it is, it's a funny one. And I think Ireland, it was something we discussed the other day about how things are in different countries. And when I was on the RIBA Awards group for years, which is going around judging the RIBA Awards every year, I was somehow aware that there were much fewer women in high profile in British practice than here. And I sort of stopped one day and thought, well, we've got Grafton Architects, we've got Ian Peng, we've got Buckles McAvoy, we've got us, we've got Gary Nianey. So many, most of the most well-known, critically acclaimed practices in Ireland are led by at least one, if not all, women. And I think that's really important in terms of, you almost forget until you go over to London and find actually, it's maybe improved a bit now, but this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that wasn't so much the case. And also in the schools in London, women weren't teaching as much. So Ireland is actually pretty good, I would say. But
I think that wonderful event in DIT, which unfortunately I wasn't able to get to, I know Colette was part of that, where the project architects for the different buildings came, and they were women.
But I think it's a platform, as I was speaking to Michael earlier, it's actually not that it was very specifically not to talk about a difference. It was just to say we're here, building buildings. It wasn't.
It's about visibility,
Visibility.
Yeah.
Any questions to finish up? We're all dying to get back upstairs to finish those canapes and all, and the RIAI wine. Are we done? Okay. No, seriously, you're all really welcome to go back upstairs and continue to network and chat and finish off that wine that's up there. Please do. And enjoy the evening for as long as you want. I unfortunately won't be able to stay with you. I have to head off, but you're all very welcome to stay. And I hope you enjoyed this evening. And finally, I would just like to say an enormous thank you to Sheila for her time, because I know how busy she is. Thank you.